East Texas was rocked by tragedy in 1983. 5 employees of a small fast food restaurant were gunned down in an isolated oil field as the Friday Night Lights crowd cheered on their beloved hometown football teams. Their assassinations would rock Kilgore, Texas to its core. For the next 20 years, the 5 victims' families, the Kilgore Police Department, the Texas Rangers, and the FBI would strive for justice. Despite all of this effort, there is still more questions than answers. For the residents of Kilgore, Texas, Friday, September 23, 1983 was unlike any other. A football game had the attention of most of the town, as the day was drawing to a close. Employees at the local fast food KFC restaurant were getting ready to close up for the night. Mary Tyler, 37, Opie Hughes, 39, and Joey Johnson, 20, were working the late shift together and had been visited by David Maxwell, 20, an off-duty employee, and Monte Landers, 19, who had plans with Joey after he got off work. The last of the customers had just finished their food. The staff was getting ready to close down and sanitize all of the food stations. The day's takings had been counted and declared via phone to head office. They'd be on their way home in no time, or so they thought. Unbeknownst to the staff, someone had heard this call, and a plan was put in place to rob the store. As they began to head towards the front door to lock it and close up for the day, it swung open and 3 masked men forced their way in. What transpired after that is still unknown. When Mary Tyler's daughter Kim stopped by the restaurant just after 10:30 p.m. that night, she came across a disturbing scene. The restaurant was still open, lights on, but empty. Stepping inside, she saw the floor, covered in blood as well as strewn utensils on the floor, and quickly called the police. Police began searching for the missing KFC employees as soon as they were alerted, and their families were told of the abduction. A young pregnant woman called David Maxwell arrived at the KFC shortly after midnight looking for her husband, David Maxwell, who had gone to the restaurant earlier that evening and had not returned. The Texas Rangers were called in to search for the missing 5 alongside friends, family, and townspeople. Investigators quickly concluded that the 5 had been abducted. All 3 on shift that night were known for their diligence and would never have absconded like that. The search went on overnight, with groups coordinated to search various parts of the local area, but no trace of the group was found. An oil field worker in Rusk County came across what he initially mistook for heaps of abandoned clothes and trash the next morning, about 15 miles away from the restaurant along Country Road 232. The blood had dried and the flies had begun to congregate. With no landmarks to obstruct it, the smell carried on the mid-air. Unfortunately, the worker was mistaken. Lying there with the bodies of the 5 missing workers, Joey, David, Monte, and Mary were found laying face down with their heads resting on their arms. They had been shot several times in the head and neck, execution style. Opie Hughes, a wife and mother, was located a little distance away from the others. She had been raped and was found with defensive wounds on her body. Just like the other victims, she'd been shot. Investigators theorized that the perpetrators forced the victims to the ground, possibly promising them freedom if they obeyed, before killing them. Perhaps Opie understood they were being murdered after the first gun was fired, and she bolted. Another theory is that she was singled out and sexually assaulted, as she was found with defense wounds. Joey was said to have fought back. Just like Opie, Joey had been shot more than once, despite the fact that he was found laying with the others. One explanation is that the original shot missed and Joey tried to stand up in an attempt to flee and raise the alarm. Rusk County District Attorney's investigator William Brown later said of the discovery, "They all had their faces down, which is, to say the least, very unusual. If we were all to lie down, expecting to get back up in a minute, we would put our face on something to keep it from being in the dirt. That was the direction of those people. Nobody knew what the shooters were thinking. Why had they chosen this particular KFC franchise? Was one of the victims known to the perpetrators? Was cash the only motivator? Or had something else driven the deadly massacre?" The entire town erupted in a frenzy of terror. No one could figure out why the crime was committed. It could happen to anyone. So many townsfolk began double-checking their logs, staying in at night, keeping their children close, and avoiding the now-tainted KFC franchise. Soon, the case began to take on a life of its own. It became well known in the area and throughout Texas, as it became a certain technique of gaining street cred. Underground criminals began boasting about their involvement in the crime. It was Kilgore's most heinous crime, and doing it and getting away with it earned criminals an unmatched seal of approval. Unfortunately, this made the police's work more difficult. The police initially were hopeful they would be able to close the case and find the perpetrators. Joey's autopsy revealed a broken fingernail lodged beneath his wristband, which was thought to be a crucial clue. Mary Tyler was discovered to have DNA evidence on her body. When they looked into Mary's background, they discovered that she was the mother of 3 who supported her family by working at KFC. The 3 children whom Mary had worked so hard to support were not left without a mother. There was little else to suggest who might have committed the murders. Texas Rangers handed the case over to the police to investigate further, but the department was short on cash. Even though police were able to bring in dogs and interview residents, some key details were overlooked. The crime scene was not secured for up to a day after the deaths were discovered, and crime scene images were not sent off for development and were therefore lost. The police searched every inch of the crime site for everything that could help them solve the crime. But due to poor effort, the investigation made to protect the crime scene, there was not much to be found. However, one police officer noticed there was blood on the floor. Further analysis concluded that the blood did not belong to any of the 5 victims. It had been wiped on a napkin, scrunched up, and tossed into the undergrowth. Tests and samples were collected and forwarded to the laboratory. But aside from that, the police discovered nothing that could lead them to the killer's identities. The cops had a few leads: the nail clippings, the rape victim's DNA, and the spilled blood. However, they ran into dead ends everywhere else they searched. In the restaurant, there were no other witnesses. According to one report, there was a van in the vicinity that was possibly used to take the victims from the restaurant to the oil field, but it was too dark and no one could describe it well. In the neighborhood, there were no CCTV cameras. A witness stated that she had overheard Mary Tyler's daughter calling her mother earlier in the evening to inform her that there was $3,000 in the tills that night that needed to be sent to the bank. The witness stated she saw a man listening to the call and offered the detectives a description of him: Darnell Hartsfield and his cousin Romeo Pinkerton, both of whom resided in the area, matched the description given, were questioned by police. They were ruled out by the police because they claimed to have excellent alibis. James Mankins, the son of statesman and a renowned crook, was another possible suspect in the case. Mankins had been overheard threatening individuals in town, had a ripped fingernail, and was known to have borrowed a gun during the time of the massacre. Mankins didn't fit the witness's description, but he was accused based on hearsay and the notion that the torn fingernail looked like a match. However, when the fingernail was analyzed, it was found to belong to Mary Tyler, not Mankins, and all charges against him were dropped. After the charges were dropped, Mankins said, 100%, I'm innocent, and I resent even the question. The worst part was the 6 months in jail over there, thinking about being put to death for something I didn't do, and more than likely, if it weren't for that DNA, I would have been on death row. There have been no recent instances of local crime or comparable incidents. The 3 men appeared and vanished like ghosts, first appearing at a KFC, robbing about $3,000, and then murdering everyone who saw them. The cops began to cast a bigger and wider net. However, no more leads were found. Nothing they did got them any closer to a solution. They only came across shadows, stories, and educated estimates. Nothing would hold up in court. Eventually, the case went cold. Although the KFC Massacre was declared a cold case, all of the evidence was kept on file. They revisited the case every several years. They found a new suspect every several years. Newspapers or television news might occasionally run articles at the time, especially if someone had a new notion or the cops suspected they had a new lead. But nothing ever moved forward. In November 2005, a DNA match was discovered against 2 guys who had previously been identified by the police: Darnell Hartsfield and Romeo Pinkerton. They were cousins who had spent their entire lives together. The key was Hartsfield. He was serving a life sentence for a different crime in 2005. Due to his involvement in another case, he had been convicted of severe perjury. His DNA was tested again while he was incarcerated. It came as a match this time. It matched the blood on a box and a napkin discovered at the crime scene. It was sufficient to reopen the investigation. Prosecutors began assembling all of the evidence they would need to convict Darnell Hartsfield and his cousin for the KFC slaughter. 3 days after the KFC slayings, Hartsfield was arrested in Smith County for aggravated robbery, according to prison records. He was released on parole in 1992, but it was overturned 2 years later, and he was sent back to prison in 1995. Pinkerton, whose birth name is Ronnie, was sentenced to prison for the first time in 1981 for a Smith County burglary. He claimed he was in prison at the time of the murders. However, records show he was released 2 days before the killings. More than 2 decades had passed since the murders when Hartsfield case reached court. The trial had to be transferred 100 miles to Bryan due to the crime's notoriety. The case was built around the testimony of a Tyler convenience store employee who said she was robbed 3 days after the killings. The convenience shop robbery and the KFC robbery, prosecutors claimed, were very similar. but one had gone catastrophically wrong. The judge agreed after some debate over whether the testimony could be heard. Not only did the woman testify about the robbery, but she also named Darnell Hartsfield as the perpetrator. She was the sole one of only 4 witnesses, including a now-deceased Texas Ranger who had worked at the crime scene. It provided a convincing story of a robbery gone wrong when combined with DNA evidence. The 3 men stormed into the restaurant, demanded money, and then fled without leaving any witnesses. They'd taken their victims to an abandoned oil field and raped one of them before killing them all. Even though DNA evidence linked Hartsfield and Pinkerton to the case, both men denied any involvement. However, it was sufficient to persuade the jurors. After just 2 hours of deliberation, both men were found guilty, but just narrowly escaped the death penalty. Juanita Pixley, a juror, stated, "It was there. I had no problem with the decision." A former convenience store employee who was robbed 3 days after the KFC slayings was allowed to testify earlier Tuesday by the trial judge. Hartsfield admitted to the robbery, and prosecutors claimed the 2 incidents were very similar. Hartsfield was identified as the robber, and she reported him ordering her and a co-worker to lie face down on the floor. In the oil-filled road, the KFC victims were discovered face down. After the verdict, Hartsfield's lawyer, Thad Davidson, stated, "It was a match in a pool of gasoline the jury had." The families of the victims who were present in court were relieved. Lana, Maxwell's widow, said, "I just want peace in my life. I don't get to go back. That would be closure. I know I'll see him someday." The case, however, took an unexpected turn. Although one of Texas's most notorious unsolved murders has been solved, Pinkerton and Hartsfield issued a caution as they were led away from court. They claimed a 3rd male was present that night. He was the one who murdered the victims and sexually assaulted Opie Hughes. That's why neither Pinkerton nor Hartsfield's DNA matched the DNA found on Opie. They warned that the 3rd man was still out there, but they wouldn't say who he was, even though there was no match in the police database. Profiling revealed that the sperm belonged to a white male of a similar age to Pinkerton and Hartsfield. The families of the victims spoke of the devastation of losing their loved ones. Lana, David's wife, stated that she will never be able to completely forget the murders of September 23, 1983. She claimed that the trauma of losing her husband, along with the years spent waiting for the investigation to conclude, led her second marriage to fall apart. She is now in her 3rd marriage, which she admits has its ups and downs, but she no longer feels the weight of the case as much as she did previously. "I suffered for all those years because I couldn't let go," she added, almost crying. "I could change my hair or something else, but I wasn't changing what was inside." Kirsty Nicholson said her mother was affected by the murder of her older brother, Monte Landers, but she remained strong for her children. Miss Nicholson recalls her mother crying the night she found out her son had been murdered. "I had to lay in bed with her, and she cried, and not just cry. She's like wailing, as I've never heard anyone cry before, and she said, 'I can't believe I laid here in bed asleep, as my child was being murdered out in the woods.'" Both Pinkerton and Hartsfield have claimed innocence ever since they were sentenced. "There's more to this," claims Romeo Pinkerton. Pinkerton says he had no part in the killings of 5 persons abducted during a robbery of a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant in Kilgore a year and a half after entering a plea that sentenced him to 5 life sentences. The real killer is out there, still walking around, Pinkerton told the Associated Press from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice's Robertson Unit. Pinkerton told them, "I'm innocent all day long in this case. I never took anybody's life." Pinkerton said he accepted the plea offer in the middle of his 2007 trial, where he faced the possibility of death because he thought his life was in peril at the Bowie County Jail, where his trial had been moved due to media attention. "I wasn't going to take it." Pinkerton, who turns 51 this month, explained, "But they were trying to kill me. If you look at this case, you've got 2 black guys. That's all that matters," Pinkerton stated. Pinkerton's denials were neither surprising nor compelling, according to Michael Jimerson, the Rusk County District Attorney who assisted in the prosecution of the 2 cousins. "It's not very persuasive to me," he remarked. "We have that DNA, that blood evidence, putting him there." Pinkerton claimed that the blood that linked him and his cousin to the murders has been planted. It's all about conspiracy in this case. Of course, the biggest argument against any sort of conspiracy against the cousins is the fact that detectives in 1983 would not have recognized the significance of the blood evidence, according to Jimerson, because DNA testing was not available at the time. One of Pinkerton's trial lawyers, David Griffith, concurred with Jimerson that his client's conspiracy idea was hard to believe. It would take around 5 years for someone to plant evidence before DNA became useful as a forensic instrument, Griffith added. That would be like somebody planting evidence of ballistics 5 years before guns were invented. Pinkerton said he no longer had an attorney, but remains hopeful that his sentence would be reversed on appeal. "I'm pleading for my innocence. I'm pretty sure if things go the way I think they're going to go, the court's going to see that." Joey Johnson's sister spoke out against the parole board in 2019 for allowing Pinkerton and Hartsfield to keep applying for release. When Judy, Joey's sister, receives a notice from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Parole Division, her heart drops. "I have to answer how I feel about the person who killed those 5 people. I hate to write impact statements, but I do, and I will do it every time," she said last week. "I don't want them to inflict that on anyone else. Romeo and Darnell do not deserve freedom. I do not think they deserve it. I think they can spend the rest of their lives behind bars for what they did." As of today, the third assailant has never been caught, despite Opie's husband begging Pinkerton and Hartsfield to reveal his identity. The perpetrator of the KFC Massacre may still be on the loose.